So picture this. It's September 23, 2010, in Florence, Kentucky. A normal night, nothing unusual, just another evening in the life of Paige Johnson. She's 17 years old, young, full of energy, and like most teenagers, she just wants to have fun, hang out, and escape the usual routine of high school, family life, and the daily grind. She's got a daughter, a little baby girl, and while she's young, she's doing her best to navigate the ups and downs of being a teen mom. It's not easy, but she's trying. She's got dreams, she wants more for herself, but like so many at that age, she's still figuring things out. That night, she tells her family she's going to hang out with friends. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. She's just being a teenager. But the person she chooses to spend her time with? That's where things start to feel off. See, she's not hanging out with kids from her school or some lifelong best friend. She's with a guy named Jacob Bumpass. Now, Jacob is 22. He's older, not by decades, but old enough that it raises some eyebrows. You gotta ask yourself, what is a 22-year-old dude doing hanging around with a 17-year-old girl? It's not like they go to the same school, have mutual college friends, or work together. It's one of those weird dynamics that, in hindsight, makes you go, something doesn't seem right about that. But at the time, no one really thinks too much about it. Jacob isn't some big scary dude with a criminal record or anything like that. He's just a guy. A little rough around the edges, sure, but nothing that immediately screams danger. So when Paige gets into his car that night, no one's thinking this is the last time they're ever going to see her. Now, from what we know, they drive around for a while, maybe drinking, maybe just killing time. There's no exact timeline for everything that happened, but we know they were together. And then, according to Jacob, sometime around 1 a.m., he says he drops Paige off in Covington, Kentucky, specifically at 15th and Scott Street. Just drops her off and drives away. Simple, right? Except, there's one problem. There's no proof that ever actually happened. No cameras, no witnesses. No one saw Paige get out of that car. No one saw her walking around. No one saw her go anywhere. It's like she just vanished into thin air. The next morning, Paige's family expects her to come home. But she doesn't. Hours pass, and there's nothing. No calls, no texts, no messages on social media. Radio silence. That's not like Paige. She's a teenager, sure, but she's a mom too, and she doesn't just disappear without saying something. That's when the worry starts creeping in. Where is she? Why hasn't she called? Her mom, Donna, starts calling around, asking friends if they've seen her, but no one knows anything. It's not long before panic sets in, and they do the only thing they can. They report her missing. Now, when the police get involved, things move pretty fast. The first person they want to talk to, Jacob Bumpass. After all, he's the last known person to have seen her, and right away, there are problems with his story. First, he's got no real explanation for what happened after he dropped her off. No details about who she might have been meeting or where she was going. Just a vague, I left her there, and nothing more. But even worse, his phone records don't match his words, because instead of his phone pinging near 15th and Scott Street around that time, it actually pings nowhere near there. It pings in Ohio, specifically near East Fork Lake, a remote, heavily wooded area about 30 miles away. Now, why the hell would Jacob Bumpass be at East Fork Lake in the middle of the night? And even more suspicious, why didn't he say he was there? If he really had nothing to do with Paige's disappearance, why lie? Why leave that part out? At this point, the police know something isn't right. Jacob's story doesn't add up, and they can feel it in their gut. He knows more than he's saying. But here's the problem. They have no evidence. They have nothing to tie him to a crime because at that point, They don't even know if a crime happened. And that's the thing that's so frustrating about cases like this. The police believe something happened, but belief isn't enough. Without a body, without a crime scene, without something solid, there's no case. So despite all the red flags, despite the phone records, despite the gut instinct that Jakob Bompas knows exactly what happened to Paige, he walks free. And for 10 years, an entire decade, Paige's family is left in limbo. No answers, no closure, just a constant cycle of hoping for news and being met with silence. Every missing persons case is painful, but there's something especially cruel about the not knowing. Did she suffer? Did she die quickly? Did she call out for her family in her final moments? No one knew. But then in 2020, everything changed. A man walking in the woods near East Fork Lake, the exact place Jacob's phone pinged that night, stumbles across something chilling. A skull. A human skull. All right, let's really get into it. Imagine you're sitting here with me, and I'm telling you this story in full detail, no rush, just laying it all out so you can truly understand the weight of what happened. So, Jacob Bompas, the last known person to see Paige Johnson alive, says he dropped her off in Covington, Kentucky, right? That's his story. He tells the police that sometime around 1 a.m. on September 23, 2010, he let her out of his car at the corner of 15th and Scott Street. Now, on the surface, it sounds simple. He picked her up, they hung out for a bit, and then he dropped her off. That's what happens every day between friends, right? People get dropped off, go their separate ways, and that's that. But here's where things start to not add up. Because while Jacob insists that's where he left her, there is absolutely no evidence that Paige was ever there. And I don't just mean that no one remembers seeing her. I mean there is literally zero proof that she ever set foot in Covington that night. No witnesses, no security footage, no camera captures her getting out of his car, walking down the street, waiting for someone, nothing. Now, let's think about this logically. Covington isn't some ghost town where you can just disappear without a trace. It's a city. There are cars, there are people, there are businesses that have security cameras running all the time. But somehow, not a single person saw Paige at 1 a.m. on that corner. And listen, it's not like the police didn't check. They went through everything, asked people in the area, pulled any available security footage, tried to trace her movements. But there was nothing. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. Now, let me ask you this. What are the chances that a 17-year-old girl who had been hanging out with a 22-year-old guy just disappears right after getting out of his car and nobody sees anything? What are the odds that not a single camera picks her up, even though Covington has plenty of places where surveillance footage is rolling at all hours? I'll tell you what the odds are. They are slim to none, and that right there, that's a problem. See, when someone goes missing, the last person they were with is always the most important person to investigate. That's just basic common sense. If you're the last person to see someone before they disappear, then naturally the police are going to start with you. And for good reason, because in most cases, that person usually knows something. So, when Jacob says, yeah, I dropped her off in Covington and left, the police start looking for anything that can back up that claim. But the more they look, the more obvious it becomes, there's nothing backing up his story. No cameras, no calls, no texts, no footprints, no evidence at all that Paige was ever there. Now, let's break this down even further. Let's just assume for a second that Jacob was telling the truth, just for argument's sake. If he really did drop Paige off at 15th and Scott Street, wouldn't she have texted someone, called someone, walked somewhere that was covered by a security camera? Wouldn't there be some kind of sign, some kind of proof that she was there, But there wasn't. And this is where it gets even sketchier. See, when investigators started digging deeper into Jakob's whereabouts that night, they found something that completely contradicted his story. Because, according to his cell phone records, Jakob's phone didn't ping anywhere near 15th and Scott Street. Nope. Instead, it pinged somewhere completely different. A location that, let me tell you, made everything way more suspicious. His phone records placed him near East Fork Lake, Ohio, around the time Paige supposedly vanished. Now, let's pause for a second. Think about this. If Jacob really did drop Paige off in Covington at 1 a.m., like he claimed, then why did his phone show that he was nowhere near there? Why did his phone ping near a remote wooded area in Ohio instead? And more importantly, why did he lie about it? Because, let's be real, people don't just accidentally end up at a place like East Fork Lake in the middle of the night. That's not somewhere you just pass through on your way home. That's the kind of place you go to on purpose. That's the kind of place you go to when you don't want to be seen. And suddenly this whole story starts looking a lot darker. Because now we're not just dealing with a missing person. We're dealing with a lie. A lie that raises an even bigger question. What really happened to Paige that night? If Jacob had nothing to hide, why not just tell the truth? If he really was at East Fork Lake, why not just say so? The only reason to lie about your location is if you don't want people to know what you are doing there. And that is the moment when everything starts to shift. Because now, Jacob isn't just the last person to see Paige. Now, he's a guy who lied about where he was on the same night that a 17-year-old girl vanished. And yet, despite all of this, despite the contradictions in his story, despite the fact that the only person who could confirm where Paige was had just been caught lying, there was still no physical evidence. The police had nothing concrete to arrest him on. So, as much as they wanted to hold him, as much as they wanted to get answers, they had no choice but to let him walk free. And for nearly 10 years, Paige Johnson remained missing. Her family was left in the dark. The questions went unanswered. And Jacob Bumpass? He just went on with his life, never once explaining why his phone records told a different story than he did. For 10 years, her family held on to hope. Hope that she was still out there somewhere. Hope that they would find her. Hope that someone would finally come forward with the truth. But that truth, that proof, it wouldn't come until nearly a decade later, when a single discovery in the woods would finally blow this entire case wide open. All right, let's break this down properly, piece by piece. Imagine we're sitting here, and I'm telling you this story exactly how it unfolded. No shortcuts, no missing details, just the full truth laid out for you. So, Jacob Bumpass told police he dropped Paige Johnson off in Covington, Kentucky around 1 a.m. on September 23, 2010. That was his story. He was firm about it. He said he let her out of his car at the corner of 15th and Scott Street, then drove off. End of story. But here's the thing. Police weren't just going to take his word for it. This was a missing persons case, and when a teenage girl disappears, you don't just accept what the last person to see her says at face value. You check, you investigate, you dig deeper. And when they did, they found something that completely shattered his story. See, in today's world, our phones track everything. Every time you send a text, make a call, or even just have your phone turned on, it's constantly pinning off cell towers, leaving behind a digital footprint of where you are. It's one of the easiest ways to verify someone's location, because, unlike people, phones don't lie. So when police pulled Jacob Bumpass's phone records, expecting to see his phone pinning near Covington at the time he claimed to have dropped Paige off, they were met with something completely different, because instead of being anywhere near 15th and Scott Street, his phone was pinging in an entirely different state. His signal had connected to a tower miles away, out in a secluded area of Ohio, a place called East Fork Lake. Now, let's just take a second to think about that. If Jacob was telling the truth, if he really did just drop Paige off and go home, then why did his phone place him in an entirely different area, far outside of Covington? Not just a little detour, not just a short drive away, but all the way out at East Fork Lake. A heavily wooded, isolated area nearly 30 miles from where he said he was. That's not just a mistake. That's not a small detail you forget. That's a big gaping hole in his alibi, and one that instantly made police start looking at him differently. Because, let's be real, what business does Jacob Bumpass have at East Fork Lake at 1 a.m? This isn't a place you just end up on accident. It's not on the way home from Covington. It's not a casual stop. It's the kind of place people go when they want to be alone, when they want privacy, when they don't want to be seen. And the fact that his phone was pinging out there on the same night Paige disappeared? Yeah, that's not just a coincidence. That's a huge red flag. So, naturally, police questioned him about it. They confronted him with the phone records, and guess what? He had nothing to say. No explanation, no good reason for why his phone was miles away from where he claimed to be. He just shut down. Now, let me ask you this. If you were innocent, wouldn't you have an answer? Wouldn't you have some kind of explanation for why your phone put you in a completely different state? Because here's the thing. Police don't just assume someone is guilty right away, but when they catch you lying, when your story doesn't match the facts, that's when they start really looking at you. And Jacob's silence? His inability to explain why his phone pinged at East Fork Lake that night? That spoke volumes. But here's where it gets frustrating. Even though they knew he was lying, even though everything pointed to him being involved, they had no physical evidence tying him to a crime, and that there was no body, no crime scene, no hard evidence that the prolescent impossible. Let them work. They was even dead. They were no bones, and they couldn't rest. All they had was suspicion. And so, Jacob Bumpass, he walked free. For 10 years this went unsolved. For 10 years Paige's family had to live with the unbearable reality that their daughter was missing, and the only person who might know what happened to her wasn't talking. But then, nearly a decade later, something happened that would finally turn the tide, because in 2020, a man walking through the woods near East Fork Lake made a discovery that would change everything. All right, let's really dig into this. Imagine you're hearing this story as it happened. Every detail, every frustration, every moment of agony that Paige Johnson's family went through for nearly a decade. Because this isn't just about a missing person. This is about the unbearable reality of what happens when a case goes cold. So Paige Johnson disappeared on September 23, 2010. One moment, she was a 17-year-old girl, full of life, with a baby daughter at home. The next, she was just gone. No trace, no calls, no messages, no explanation. And right away the police had their eyes on Jacob Bumpass. After all, he was the last person to see her. But as suspicious as his story was, as many red flags as there were, They didn't have what they needed to make an arrest, because here's the thing, you can't charge someone with murder if you don't have a body. And that was the biggest problem in this case. Paige didn't just vanish. She disappeared without a trace. There was no crime scene, no blood, no physical evidence that proved something violent had happened. There was just nothing. And that's how cases go cold. Because at first there was hope. In those first few weeks, her family thought maybe she was just out there somewhere. Alive, scared, unable to come home for some reason. They hoped she'd walk through the door, call someone, send a message. Maybe she was being held against her will. Maybe she was too afraid to reach out. Maybe she just needed time. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and then, before anyone even realized it, a full year had gone by. And Paige, still nowhere to be found. Now, let me tell you something about missing person cases. After the first 48 hours, things get tough. The longer someone is missing, the harder it becomes to find them. Leads dry up, people move on, memories fade. And when there's no new evidence, no new witnesses coming forward, the case starts to slip further and further down the list of priorities for law enforcement. That doesn't mean they don't care. It doesn't mean they stop looking entirely. But when there's nothing to go on, what can they do? And that's exactly what happened here. For years, Paige's case sat in this horrible limbo, not forgotten, but completely stalled. Police believed something terrible had happened to her. They knew in their gut that Jacob Bumpass had the answers they needed. But knowing and proving are two very different things. And Jacob? He wasn't talking. Now, I want you to put yourself in Paige's family's shoes for a second. Imagine waking up every single day for 10 years not knowing. Every time the phone rings, your heart stops. Because maybe, just maybe, it's the call that finally tells you what happened. But every time, it's not. It's just another dead end, another reminder that your daughter is gone and no one knows where. Donna Johnson, Paige's mother, never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped fighting for answers. She put up missing posters. She called the police constantly. She refused to let her daughter's name fade away. She demanded that people remember Paige. And every time she saw Jacob Bumpass out in the world, living his life like nothing had happened, it must have felt like a slap in the face. Because while Paige's family was suffering, he was free. And that's the cruelest part of cases like this. When someone goes missing, and there's no body, no confession, no hard evidence, you can know in your heart who's responsible, but without proof, you're just stuck. The years passed. Paige's daughter grew up without a mother. Holidays came and went, life moved on for the world, but for her family, time stood still. And for nearly a decade the case remained ice cold. But then, after 10 years of silence, after 10 years of unanswered questions, after 10 years of waiting, the case that everyone thought might never be solved finally took a turn. Because in 2020 something happened. A man was walking through the woods near East Fork Lake, the very same place where Jacob Bumpass's phone had pinged that night. Just an ordinary day, just someone out in nature minding their business, and then he stumbled upon something. Something that no one was expecting. A skull. A human skull. And just like that, after 10 long years, Paige Johnson's case was suddenly wide open again. All right, let's really walk through this moment. Picture it. It's early March 2020. The world is just beginning to shift into chaos with the start of the pandemic. But in a quiet, wooded area near East Fork Lake in Ohio, something else, something completely unexpected is about to happen. A man is out walking through the woods. Maybe he's just out for some fresh air. Maybe he's exploring a familiar trail, or maybe he's simply looking for a moment of peace in nature. Either way, he's not expecting to find anything out of the ordinary. It's just another walk, another day. But then, as he moves through the trees, something catches his eye. Something small, something pale, something that at first glance could almost be mistaken for just another piece of the forest floor, maybe a rock, maybe an animal bone. But as he steps closer, as his eyes adjust, a sickening realization washes over him. Because this isn't just some random object, it's a human skull. And in that instant, everything changes. Now let's stop for a second and think about what this means. Because for 10 years, Paige Johnson's case had gone absolutely nowhere. For 10 years, her family had been living in a nightmare, trapped in a cycle of endless hope and crushing disappointment. For 10 years, they had no answers, no leads, nothing. And then, just like that, in the middle of a forest, a decade-old mystery begins to unravel. The hiker immediately calls the police, and when investigators arrive, they know this isn't just some random discovery. This is big. This is important. The remains are collected, sent for testing, and within days it's confirmed. The skull belongs to Paige Johnson. And just like that, the Johnson family finally has the answer they've been dreading for 10 long years. Paige isn't missing. Paige isn't coming home. Paige is dead. Now, I want you to really sit with that for a second. Because when someone you love disappears, there's always this small part of you that holds on to hope, even when logic tells you otherwise. Even when you know deep down that the chances are slim. That tiny piece of you refuses to let go. Maybe she's out there, maybe she's alive, maybe she'll be found. But when you get a call like this, that hope is ripped away in an instant. Paige's mother, Donna, gets the news. And imagine what that must feel like. Imagine getting that phone call after 10 years. You pick up the phone, and on the other end, someone is telling you that your daughter has been found. But not alive. Not in some faraway place waiting to come home. She's been found in the woods, reduced to bones. And suddenly, the grief you've been carrying for 10 years, the grief you've tried to push down, the grief you've refused to fully accept because you didn't have proof, it crushes you all at once. But here's the thing. As heartbreaking as this discovery was, it also meant something important. It meant that after a decade of waiting, Paige was no longer just a missing person. She was now a homicide victim. And that changed everything. Because remember, Jacob Bumpus had been walking free for all these years. He had never been charged. He had never been forced to explain himself beyond his initial statements, and even though his phone records had placed him near East Fork Lake that night, there was no body. But now there was. Now, the police had a crime scene. Now, they could officially classify this as a murder investigation. And that meant one thing. Jacob Bumpus's time was running out. Imagine standing at a desolate crime scene in the middle of a dense forest, the air heavy with a mix of autumn chill and an unspoken sorrow. In front of you, lying among the scattered leaves and tangled undergrowth, is nothing more than a human skull. This single, haunting relic is all that remained of a young life. Paige's life. The discovery sends shockwaves through the investigative team because, while it confirms the worst fears of her family and community, it leaves behind a gaping void of unanswered questions. Without the rest of her remains, the forensic experts are left in a near impossible position. They cannot definitively determine how she met her tragic end. When the skull was first recovered, it was meticulously bagged and transported to the lab. There, a team of forensic pathologists began their painstaking work. Typically, In a homicide investigation, every fragment of physical evidence plays a crucial role: soft tissue, blood, any trace of foreign substances. Each bit can tell a part of the story. In this case, however, the absence of these vital clues turned the investigation into a labyrinth of speculation. The bone, weathered by time and nature, bore no obvious signs of trauma. It showed the subtle marks of aging and decay, but nothing that could decisively pinpoint a cause of death. There were no clear fractures, no lacerations, no bullet holes, nothing to indicate whether the fatal blow was delivered by blunt force, a fall, or something even more sinister. The pathologists worked with what they had: microscopic examinations, X-rays, and digital reconstructions of the skull's features. They scrutinized every curve and crevice, looking for any anomaly that might hint at foul play. But the skull, in its silent testimony, offered few concrete answers. Without the surrounding bones, muscle impressions, or even traces of tissue that could have harbored toxins or drugs, it was like trying to solve a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. The investigators were left with a chilling question that reverberated in every room of the police station. How do you determine a death when you only have the echoes of it left behind? This singular bone not only confirmed the tragic reality that Paige had died, but also underscored the brutality of a case that had already stretched on for nearly a decade. In many ways, the skull became both the last vestige of Paige and the catalyst for new legal and emotional battles. Her family, who had long clung to the hope that she might still be found alive, now had the irrefutable evidence that their daughter was gone. Yet, without a clear cause of death, their search for justice and closure was thrown into a deeper, more complex uncertainty. The lack of additional remains meant that the usual forensic markers, the kind that might reveal if she had suffered a violent struggle, an accidental death, or a subtle poisoning, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the rest of her had been deliberately removed, or perhaps nature had taken its relentless course over time, leaving behind only this stark reminder of what once was. The investigators debated possibilities. Could it be that the trauma that killed her had been so severe that it obliterated all evidence, leaving nothing but the skull behind? Or was there something even more methodical about her disappearance, a chilling attempt to erase her story from the world? Every theory brought with it a new wave of anguish and frustration, especially for those who had been waiting for answers for years. The forensic team, despite their expertise and state-of-the-art technology, could only offer probabilities and educated guesses. They speculated on whether the skull might have been subjected to intense heat, perhaps from a fire, or if it bore microscopic evidence of blunt force that was too subtle to be seen without the support of the rest of the skeleton. Each possibility, however, fell short of providing a definitive cause of death. The silence of the skull was deafening. It confirmed her death, but left the narrative of her final moments shrouded in mystery. For the detectives, the undetermined cause of death was both a curse and a challenge. It meant that without a clear understanding of how Paige had died, linking a motive or even a perpetrator to the crime became exponentially more difficult. Every piece of circumstantial evidence was re-examined, every detail of her last known whereabouts scrutinized, but the missing elements made it nearly impossible to construct a full, coherent picture. The trail went cold once more, and with it, the hope that justice would soon be served. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, the discovery of the skull sparked a renewed, if bittersweet, determination among those who believed in uncovering the truth. The fragment of bone, so ordinary yet so profoundly significant, became a symbol of the urgent need to re-examine every detail of the case. It forced the investigators to confront the harsh reality that sometimes, even with the best scientific tools at our disposal, nature or human intervention can erase the evidence needed to deliver a definitive answer. In the end, the fact that only Paige's skull was found, and nothing more, left a permanent void in the case. Her cause of death remained a painful mystery, a stark reminder of how elusive truth can be when time, nature, and circumstance conspire to cover up the final chapter of a life lost too soon. For her family and everyone seeking justice, the uncertainty remains a heavy burden, an unanswered question that haunts them with every passing day.
For over a decade, the name Jacob Bumpass had been whispered in every conversation about Paige Johnson's disappearance. He had been the last person to see her alive, the one who claimed he had simply dropped her off in Covington, Kentucky, with no evidence to back up his story. And while suspicion had always clung to him, the lack of hard proof meant he walked free while Paige's family was left with nothing but question. But in 2021, everything changed. The discovery of Paige's skull in the wooded area near East Fork Lake had reignited the case in a way that no one could ignore. For 10 years, there had been no physical evidence, nothing that tied Jacob to a crime. But now, law enforcement had proof that Paige had never made it to Covington that night. She had died, and her body had been left to rot in the middle of the wilderness, abandoned like something disposable. Police and prosecutors knew that if they had any chance of holding Jacob accountable, they had to move carefully. Without a cause of death, proving murder would be difficult, if not impossible. They needed a way to get him into custody, to push him into a corner where he might finally crack under pressure. That's when they turned their attention to the evidence they did have. Jacob's phone records had always been suspicious. His phone had pinged near East Fork Lake the night Paige vanished, despite his insistence that he had dropped her off miles away. He had lied about his whereabouts, and now, 10 years later, Paige's skull had been found in the very place his phone had been traced to. That was enough for authorities to act. In 2021, police finally arrested Jacob Bumpass, charging him with tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. It wasn't the murder charge that Paige's family had hoped for, but it was a start. It was the first real step toward justice after years of waiting. Imagine what that moment must have been like for Paige's mother, Donna. For 10 years, she had fought to keep her daughter's name from being forgotten. She had pushed, begged, and demanded answers while watching Jacob live his life freely, never held accountable for the night Paige disappeared. And now, at long last, the man she had always believed was responsible was finally in handcuffs. But while Jacob's arrest was a moment of victory, it was also a reminder of just how twisted and cruel this case had become. The charge of abuse of a corpse was particularly horrifying. It meant that at some point after Paige had died, however that happened, Jacob had done something to her body. Maybe he had moved it. Maybe he had disposed of it in a way meant to erase evidence. Maybe he had hidden it, hoping no one would ever find her. Whatever he had done, it was enough for law enforcement to say, this wasn't just a case of a girl going missing. Something had been done to Paige after she died, and Jacob Bumpass was responsible. Jacob's arrest sent a wave of emotions through the community. For years, people had speculated about what really happened to Paige that night. Some had believed Jacob was guilty all along, while others had held on to the possibility that maybe he had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now his arrest made one thing clear. He had never been honest about that night. He had known more than he ever admitted. And by hiding the truth for over a decade, he had not only robbed Paige's family of closure, but had also managed to evade justice for far too long. His arrest also raised even more questions. If Jacob had tampered with evidence, what evidence had he destroyed? If he had abused a corpse, what exactly had he done to Paige's body? And most importantly, was there more to be found? Police began to dig deeper, hoping that Jacob's arrest might shake loose new leads. Would he finally confess? Would he try to cut a deal to reduce his charges? Would someone else come forward now that he was in custody, offering new information that had been kept hidden for a decade? But Jacob wasn't talking. Even with the walls closing in, he remained silent, refusing to give any details about what had happened that night. He didn't confess, didn't offer any explanations, nothing. Just like he had done for the past 10 years, he kept the truth locked away, leaving Paige's family in yet another painful limbo. And that's the cruelest part of cases like this. Even with an arrest, even with charges being filed, the full truth still remains just out of reach. Paige's family had fought for justice for so long, and while Jacob's arrest was a long overdue step, it still wasn't the end of the nightmare. Because without a confession, without more physical evidence, there was still no murder charge. And that meant that even though Jacob Bumpass was behind bars, Paige's case was far from over. After a decade of waiting, after endless nights of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions, Paige Johnson's family had finally seen an arrest. Jacob Bumpass, the last person to see Paige alive, the man whose phone had pinged near the very woods where her skull was eventually found, was finally in handcuffs. It was a moment her family had been fighting for, proof that authorities weren't just letting this case disappear. But as the initial shock of his arrest faded, a harsh reality settled in. There would be no murder charge. Not because police didn't believe he was responsible, not because the evidence didn't paint him as the prime suspect, but because in the world of law and the world of criminal justice, belief is not enough. Suspicion, gut feelings, even common sense, none of that is enough to convict someone of murder. What they needed was proof, undeniable, physical evidence that Paige had been killed, that her death had been the result of a crime. And without a cause of death, without the rest of her remains, without even a single piece of forensic evidence that explained what exactly had happened to her that night, there was no way to charge Jacob Bumpass with murder. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, but it was the cold, unyielding truth of the legal system. Because think about it, what does a murder charge require? You need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person's life was taken intentionally, that someone acted with the purpose of killing them, or knowingly caused their death through their actions. But in Paige's case, how could they prove that? They didn't have a body, only a skull. They didn't have a cause of death. No gunshot wound, no signs of strangulation, no broken bones that could point to blunt force trauma. There was nothing that told them exactly how Paige had died. And if they couldn't prove how she died, how could they prove that her death was a murder? That was the impossible situation prosecutors were facing. Even though everything pointed to Jacob, even though the pieces of the puzzle lined up in a way that made it painfully obvious that he had something to do with Paige's disappearance, the case was missing the one thing that mattered most, the undeniable proof of homicide. So instead, they had to charge him with what they could prove: tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. These weren't minor charges, they were serious crimes. They meant that law enforcement had enough to say Jacob Bumpass did something to Paige's body, that after she died, whatever the circumstances, he had taken action to cover it up, that he had moved her, hidden her, disposed of her remains in a way meant to erase the truth. But that wasn't enough, not for Paige's family, not for the people who had spent years fighting for justice, because they didn't just want Jacob in jail for what he did after Paige died. They wanted him held responsible for whatever he did to cause her death in the first place. But the law wouldn't let them have that. Not without the missing pieces, not without the proof they needed to officially declare Paige's death a homicide. And that's what makes this case so frustrating, so infuriating, because Jacob Bumpass knows what happened that night. He knows how Paige died. He has held on to that truth for over a decade, refusing to say a single word, refusing to give Paige's family the closure they so desperately need. And the worst part, he doesn't have to say anything. He doesn't have to explain himself. He doesn't have to admit what he did, because without physical evidence, without proof beyond a reasonable doubt, he gets to hide behind silence. The justice system demands certainty. It demands facts. It demands evidence. And in this case, that evidence is missing. Somewhere out there, Paige's remaining bones are still undiscovered. Somewhere out there, the answers that could finally bring the truth to light are buried beneath time, beneath dirt, beneath the secrecy that Jacob refuses to break. And as long as that remains the case, as long as the final pieces of the puzzle are missing, Jacob Bumpass will never face the one charge he truly deserves: murder. After more than a decade of evading justice, after years of suspicion, questions, and heartbreak, Jacob Bumpass finally stood before a court in 2022, ready to face the consequences of what he had done. But what happened next? It wasn't the moment of justice that Paige Johnson's family had been waiting for. It wasn't the day that finally brought full closure. Instead, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Jacob took a plea deal and received just 5 years in prison. 5 years after everything, after Paige's disappearance in 2010, after her remains were found in 2020, after police confirmed that Jacob's phone had pinged near the very location where her skull was later discovered, after all the lies, after all the suspicion, 5 years was all he got. Not for murder, not even for manslaughter. Just 5 years for tampering with evidence and abuse of a corpse. Now, imagine being Paige's mother. Imagine fighting for over 12 years to get justice for your daughter, only to watch the man who last saw her alive walk away with a sentence so short it barely felt like punishment at all. 5 years wasn't enough, not by a long shot. But the truth is, prosecutors didn't have many options. They didn't have the evidence they needed to charge Jacob with murder. They didn't have a cause of death. They didn't have forensic proof that Paige had been killed. Without that, the case was always going to be difficult to prosecute. And Jacob knew that. He knew that the system required hard proof. He knew that by keeping his mouth shut, by refusing to talk, by never revealing what really happened to Paige, he was protecting himself. He had spent years staying silent, watching as the case went cold, knowing that as long as the truth stayed buried, he could never be charged with murder. And when the time finally came, when the pressure was on, when law enforcement had just enough evidence to charge him with something, Jacob made the move that so many guilty people make. He took a plea deal. Because with a plea deal, he could avoid the risk of a trial. He wouldn't have to face a jury. He wouldn't have to worry about prosecutors finding a way to convict him on more serious charges. Instead, he pleaded guilty to the lesser charges and accepted his sentence, 5 years. But here's the part that makes it even worse. With time served and good behavior, he won't even serve the full 5 years. That's right. The man who took Paige out that night, the man whose phone pinged near the woods where she was later found, the man who undeniably did something to her body after she died. He'll be out of prison before the decade is over. Meanwhile, Paige's family will never get her back. They will never hear the truth. They will never see Jacob held fully accountable for what really happened. And that's what makes this case so devastating, because the justice system, it doesn't always deliver justice. It works on facts, not feelings. It works on proof, not suspicion. And in Paige's case, the lack of a cause of death, the missing evidence, the deliberate silence from Jacob Bumpass, all of it meant that prosecutors were stuck with only what they could prove. And what they could prove wasn't enough. Not for Paige, not for her family, not for the people who had spent more than a decade fighting for her. Because in just a few years, Jacob Bumpass will walk free. He will go on with his life. He will get a second chance, something he never gave Paige. And that is a tragedy all on its own. Even after Jacob Bumpass took his plea deal and was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, Paige Johnson's family and the public refused to accept that this was the end of the story. They had fought too hard for too long to simply let it go. To them, this wasn't justice, it was an insult. A slap in the face after more than a decade of waiting for answers. Because in their hearts, they knew what had happened. Maybe they couldn't prove it in a court of law, but the facts, the circumstances, and the overwhelming weight of common sense all pointed to one undeniable truth. Jacob Bumpass got away with murder. And if he wasn't going to tell the truth, if the justice system wasn't going to hold him fully accountable, then it was up to the public, to Paige's loved ones, to her community, to the people who had followed her case for years, to keep demanding answers. Because what happened to Paige was not just a tragedy, it was a failure. A failure of a system that requires hard evidence, even when all the circumstantial proof in the world paints a clear picture. A failure that allowed a man who had every reason to be a prime suspect to walk free after just a few short years. A failure that left a grieving mother, a devastated family, and an entire community without the full justice they deserved. But here's the thing about the people who loved Paige. They refused to let her be forgotten. They refused to let Jacob simply serve his time, get out, and go on with his life as if nothing had ever happened. They refused to let the case slip away, cold and unfinished, because justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about holding people accountable in every way possible. It's about never letting the truth be buried, never letting the guilty feel safe in their silence, never allowing someone like Jacob Bumpass to believe he can outlast the voices demanding the truth. And those voices, they haven't stopped, they won't stop. Because Paige's story isn't over. Not until every question is answered. Not until Jacob Bumpass tells the truth. Not until justice actually means justice.